Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar on the Western Vic project. Today, we're here to talk about compensation and valuation in relation to the project. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to acknowledge the various traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and pay respects to their elders past, present and future. And I'd also like to acknowledge those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people with us today. Today we have two specialists to talk to you. Paul Ower is the Land Engagement Manager for the Western Vic project. Paul has a long career in property across a range of different areas and has been on the project since its inception. And he'll be talking to you today. We also have Alan Hives, who is a specialist in valuation as a consultant, as well as growing up on a farm. Alan has over 35 years experience doing valuations and compensation for projects in rural areas, including pipelines, railway lines, roads and transmission lines, and has worked for the Valuer General as well. Might just work through some of the presentation aspects that you'll see tonight. So we're going to talk through who receives compensation, going to talk a little bit about electricity easements, talk through the compensation process, how valuation it works and what is considered and not considered in compensation. We're going to work through the valuation principles and the assessment process and engagement. It's worth saying that today's discussion is to speak generally around the process that is used in the hope that people get a clearer picture of how that works, and not to talk about specific properties or circumstances. That is something that will be worked through either with your landowner engagement officers, or if you have very specific questions at the one-on-one sessions coming up in October. In the second half of the session, we'll be working through questions and answers. A number of people have submitted questions prior to this webinar. If you have them as we work through, please add them to the chat, and I will ask them in the Q&A session of our specialists. Next slide. Just a few bits of housekeeping. By nature of its format, we can't have everybody off mute and all talking over each other. Therefore, attendees are muted. As I said, please ask your questions in the chat function. I need to point out that inappropriate language and personal attacks will not be tolerated, and it's not helpful in this format. We will attempt to get through as many questions as we can. I apologise if I can't get to yours. Often we have questions on repeat topics, so hopefully you will get answers even if your specific question isn't read out. And any outstanding questions we have, we'll use to update our FAQs on the website. The finish time tonight is 8:30. Which we'll need to stick to. So I will now pass over to Paul.
Thanks, Michael, and welcome everyone to the session tonight. I know there's probably a lot of questions that we will be hopefully able to answer for you. Michael did touch on the fact that the session tonight is specifically around compensation and valuation relating to the project. And the limitation, obviously, there, as Michael's touched on, is that until the route is determined within the corridor, we can't necessarily address individual landowners' properties or specific topics on that, but we will obviously address as much as we possibly can. So compensation, the first thing to, I suppose, talk about here is that compensation really is relating to the acquisition of an easement or an interest over property, and compensation is payable to landowners where that easement is located. For those of you that have already had a look on our website, there is further information about easements, but I just did want to touch on the fact of what an easement actually is. Where we have the transmission line running through property, it does provide us with the right to access, occupy and use part of the land owned by another person for a particular purpose. In this case, the transmission line and the alignment that ends up taking. So an easement does have certain terms and conditions, and it is formulated to determine what the easement holder, in this case the electricity authority, and the landowner can and can't do within the easement. There is a guide available on our website that does determine a little bit more about easements. It isn't necessarily the topic that we're discussing tonight, but I would encourage you to go to our website and have a look through that guide. So electricity easements and how are they formed? So easements are usually created in one of two ways. The first being the granting of an easement where the terms and conditions are negotiated between the landowner and the landholder, in this case being the landowner and the electricity authority. That does allow quite a bit of flexibility for us to discuss the terms and conditions of that easement and the rights and privileges that are afforded to both parties. In other cases, legislation does allow for the creation of easements. In those circumstances, it's usually the legislation that sets out the terms and conditions of those easements. They are referred to as statutory easements. In this case, it is the Electrical Industry Act that does determine the provisions of those easements. So we did discuss earlier that compensation is calculated and payable to people that have an easement on their property to host the power lines. And this is just a little bit about once we arrive at the point where the route is determined, which we have said will be later on, late into 2021, we will start discussing compensation with landowners where the route does directly impact on their property. So the assessment really starts where to ensure that that is fair and fully considers the impact of the easement on an individual's property, a qualified valuer will undertake the compensation assessment and valuations. You do have the opportunity, we do fully encourage landowners to discuss their property with the valuer at the time that those assessments are being done. That does allow them to discuss and fully understand the impacts of the easement on a property, and that assists in determining the compensation that is payable. You will be provided with a copy of any valuation and compensation information in writing. We have had questions previously about those assessments, and if you do obtain independent advice regarding compensation from a qualified valuer, the valuation you have obtained will be considered. And that is used as a part of the discussion between your liaison, the land liaison, and the calculation and negotiation of the assessment. So how is the amount of compensation determined? The assessment of compensation, there are certain regulations and legislation that go round on the determination of compensation. In Victoria, that legislation is the Land Acquisition and Compensation Act, and there are certain the Valuation Act and certain regulations that involve around that. It is made up of 4 different components, and we have Alan speaking on those shortly. Those 4 are detailed there. It is in relation to the market value, a component called severance, a special value, and disturbance. And I will hand over to Alan now, and he'll be able to go through those 4 different components with the people on the call.
Thanks, Paul. Good evening, everyone. So market value, I think most people would be reasonably familiar with that concept. What's the property worth? In the compensation world, we do 2 valuations, of course, the first one being market value as the property is as if the proposed, whatever it is, in this case, transmission line, didn't occur. So any influence of that's taken out. And then the second valuation is looking at the effect of the easement on the market value of the property. So look, things come into that. Of course, in this case, there's an easement. There's some shared space, people coming in using it, maybe some towers, whatever happens to be on the place. So you know, the market value of the property in that after situation is diminished by some degree, and that's the job of the valuer, to determine what that diminution in value is, that fall in value. So those things are pretty simple. concepts, I think. Every property won't be affected the same way, which is the reason why we have to go out and ideally talk to the owners to understand their position and what's going on. But there are, and the main part, well, one of the main parts of that is, well, there's two parts really. The severance, now you might appreciate that the easement is one part that affects the property, but the balance of the property can be affected by not so much the easement, but the purpose for which the easement is applied to the property. So the rest of the property that's around that is often reduced in value. And that's one of the jobs the valuer has to consider, and best considered with some input from the landowners, simply because while we might think we know what we're doing, there are circumstances in each case. Now, that comes down then to the special value component, and special value is a bit more difficult to let's say, put a definition around because it will vary, and it will vary between industries. So really it's about a financial advantage, let's say, that an owner has on a particular property that someone else wouldn't have. So a buyer coming in wouldn't get that. So that property is worth more to them than someone else. Now, there are examples of that, and really in the ag space, the one that most often comes up is, I think we're familiar with the term of overcapitalisation in the agricultural space. If I build these days, a new hay shed, big hay shed, maybe a 5-stand wool shed on 200 acres wouldn't really be justified, but it is when I've got other land in and around it and nearby that I need, let's say, a 5-stand wool shed to service my operations beyond the immediate property. So, things like grain storage, wool sheds, like I've said, those sorts of things that might be deemed an overcapitalisation and discounted by a valuer on one part of the property. But if they're servicing much more, then there's clearly some, no reason to discount them because that's what it's worth to the owner. Now, that's a simplistic approach, but there are other things that perhaps aren't quite so obvious to a valuer just looking from the outside, that ideally we get a chance to talk to the landowners to fully understand what it all means. So those things are certainly in place. Now, the next and the fourth part was about disturbance, and really, in my simplistic view, I think that technically, disturbance comes back to a direct financial loss, just simply because of really the taking of the easement and the construction of whatever's going on the easement. Those things usually happen in the first little bit. It's not usually ongoing. That should be taken into account in the other heads. But things like when in this case, when a transmission line is being built, it goes through a property, destroys pasture, crops, whatever that might be. There's clearly a financial loss for the loss of production or whatever that's been caused, and that fully compensatable for that direct loss because it can be attributed directly to the easement. And look, that detail even goes down to in a lot of our rural cases where I'm not sure how close we are to houses, but look, if the washing gets dirty on the line and there's a cost to doing all of those things because there's during that construction phase, there's a compensation that has to be paid for those items of disturbance, and that list is potentially long and many, but usually narrowed down to whatever directly affecting each of the landowners. So those extra costs that occur in that first stage are usually reimbursed, is essentially how it works. I think that's my quick summary of those 4 points, if that helps, Paul.
Yes, thanks, Alan. And as you said, there is quite a lot of components to that. where we talk about those components, obviously they do have to be assessed on an individual basis. There is obviously precedent for how they're applied across various properties, but it is important that the dialogue is opened up with landowners once the route is determined, so that we can fully understand those components and make the determination of the first offer of compensation. Obviously, there's a lot of information that we've just provided there, and you know, we don't necessarily expect that all landowners are going to fully understand the full way that legislation and provisions work. So in many cases, landowners will seek their own independent advice in around that. There are provisions here where AusNet Services do reimburse landowners the reasonable professional costs incurred by them that relate to the acquisition of the easement, and that does specifically cover off valuation costs. Sometimes there may need to be other professional services in relation to agricultural consultants and agronomists to fully understand those impacts, and obviously independent legal advice is reimbursed as part of that cost as well. So just in summary, I think Alan's touched on those 4 points. Any loss of market value across a property, and that does apply across the entire property or land holdings under that particular landholder. There's other factors there that come through that are assessed on each individual property. So I think that's this summary there today. I think we could open up for questions.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that. Thanks for that chat. I'll now start out with a couple of questions. Vicky asked a question before registration there. She said, who are the consultants for each of the subjects and what processes and investigations are they undertaking to respond to the scoping requirements? This is one I'm going to field. That aspect isn't part of the EES and not something that we're covering today. That the scoping requirements aren't something we're talking through in relation to this one. The next question we had was from Peter. Peter has asked, what is the total compensation that has been included in the total cost of the Western Vic project? And it's double barreled. If you cannot advise that figure, do we assume it was not included and therefore the cost of the project is not a true costing?
No, look, I think when the project was assessed, you know, there was assessments done on broader land values across the various regions and estimations done on that basis. But once again, that will have to be finalised when the final route is done. A lot of assessment being done at the moment in relation to ensuring that we minimise the level of disturbance that the final route will take. But at that stage, the final assessment of compensation will be undertaken, understanding that that needs to assess each property individually.
Okay, great, thank you. Darren has asked, if a landowner has a building or development permit that would add value to the land but has not started building yet, when the initial assessment is made, is the future value considered to determine the true market value?
Alan, that's a question I might throw over to yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yes, look, certainly if the project were to affect some property where it, let's say previously, was more of a lifestyle block that had the potential to build a nice home and establish those things, and that potential was impacted severely, that would factor into the before and after market value and come out as a compensatable amount. And in some cases that can be potentially reasonably significant. It just depends on exactly where and how it goes, but it'll be taken into account, certainly.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Peter. Is special value ever projected? We intend to build on our land to retire on, as an example. If someone's intending to build, is special value ever projected? Paul?
I think once again, Alan, I might pass that one across to you. It really sort of relates to the highest and best use of the land and how that's those future plans. Maybe a similar question to the last.
Yes, thanks, Paul. It's similar along the same lines as the last one. Yes, again, we would expect that the market value would capture that. Now, that's one of the reasons why we'd like to talk to people because it may not. I'd like to think that some special value, if it can be attributed, is properly considered. One way or the other. We won't want to double up, of course, but we certainly don't want to miss out.
Great, thank you. Colin has asked a question about compensation for neighbouring properties being devalued by the project.
Yeah, and in the context of the conversation we're having tonight, compensation really does relate to the location of the easement, land that is directly impacted by the easement that the power lines would be located within. There are programs that are being run to, I suppose, be of benefit to the broader communities, and I believe they're under development at the moment, but they do fall outside of the scope that we're discussing here tonight.
Okay, so just to be clear, neighbouring properties not considered in terms of compensation with what you're talking about?
No, the topic tonight, Michael, really does relate to compensation around the location of the easement and the acquisition, I suppose, of the right to have that easement within the properties. Okay.
And I think what Paul's referring to there are the broader community benefit funds and those sorts of things in terms of distributing the benefits more broadly, which will obviously capture neighbouring properties and communities. The next question we have, this is another one from Peter. Many farms are owned as a land bank, and the current valuation as a farmer will never allow for the future value with an easement or power line changing the value of its future use. How is this truly factored into the compensation?
I think the first thing there is that where there is potential, and I'll use the word speculative value of those properties being able to be developed at a future time. And we have seen this quite a bit in areas where we have urban growth zone and future development overlays in areas, that the surrounding areas that are within quite close proximity to that do increase dramatically in value under the expectation that they may have zoning changed at a later stage. So that is reflected in the current market value of those properties. Alan, I'm not sure whether you'd like to add anything into that, but I think, you know, that where we do our assessment and we are looking at market value, it is looked at the highest and best use of the land, understanding the current zonings and restrictions that are on that land for its development and use. So that is considered when the assessments are done. Obviously, we're unable to look at a value that falls outside of that for something that may occur in the future. Alan, I'm not sure whether you want to touch on that.
Yes, Paul. Look, that's the right answer. The value is reflecting the market. Now, there's a balance between that remote and speculative demand and influence that puts crazy prices on property, trying to beat the curve. But generally, the market closer to those urban centres is lifted simply because of that urban demand. Closer to town. So you see that fringe Melbourne and fringe regional centres, that influence comes out, and in that sense it reflects in the market, and is in as much as the market evidence is showing it, it will be taken into account in evaluation as market value.
Okay, great, thank you. Jim has asked a question, what is the size of an easement for a project like this?
Thanks, Jim. So the project for the Western Vic Transmission Network project does comprise two components, a 220 kV or 220 kilovolt section that runs from Bulgana back to the proposed new terminal station. The easement widths do vary depending on the width between towers and heights of towers, but traditionally they're around the 40-metre mark for the 220 kV. The component that is scheduled to run from the proposed new terminal station back to Sydenham is a 500 kV alignment, and that there does average out around about the 70 metres in width. But once again, that can fluctuate depending on the height and span between towers.
Okay. So that's an indicative amount. Okay. Moira has asked, will neighbouring landholders be able to access free advice?
I think we have people that are obviously working within our project that are speaking to neighbouring owners, etc. I think the advice, I'm not sure. We're happy to obviously open up dialogue if you're talking in relation to professional services and those sort of things, Moira. I think that's probably what part of our stakeholder team would have to probably come back to you on that.
Okay, great, thanks. It's another one from Moira. Is there allowances and compensation for planned future subdivisions?
Probably a very similar question to what we had earlier on in relation to if someone is looking to build a home and has approved plans, or whether someone has future development potential and etc. of a block. The market value is considered on a highest and best use, so what is allowable on the property, and any plans and etc. provisions there. Alan, I think that would be something for you to take into consideration. I'm not sure whether you'd like to touch on that too, Alan.
Alan, if you could tell us what highest and best use means as well, would be good.
Okay, highest and best use. I'll address that first. The highest and best use of the property is, the best thing the property can be used for, usually in an economic sense. So if I had a paddock that I could graze cattle on, that might be its highest and best use if I'm out well removed from civilization and it's not cropping country. But if I'm closer to Melbourne, I might have cattle on it, but it might have a suitable zoning to allow it to be subdivided. And it would be that subdivision value that be taken into account in that case, not what I'm using it for today, but what I can do with it. Now, the difficulty comes is where I'm still zoned farming, but it's not ready, but maybe in 10 or 15 years' time, it might look a bit different. In as much as the market is factoring into the land value in a farming zone, that'll be taken into account. The rest of it tends to be somewhat solitary and remote, but it's not going to be ignored. It's going to be considered very carefully.
Okay, great, thank you. John has asked a question. Everyone's farm and business is different. How can you account for compensation for a grazier as opposed to a potato grower?
Alan?
Yeah, I reckon that might be my field, Paul. Look, again, it's each property in its own right, and consider what it's being used for. We're going to consider what it's used for and reflect accordingly. So it's back to that highest and best use. And if it's country that can be used for potato growing, well, it's going to have a potato growing price on it.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, Michael, and if I can just touch on that as well. We have spoken earlier, and you're right, each property is individual. They're in different locations, they're different size, they have different land uses and different, I suppose, different purpose for each location and etc. And we've discussed earlier about communicating not only with the liaisons that are out in the field, capturing a lot of that information, but also the value at the time. It is really important that those things are discussed and captured because where those decisions get made on assigning value is based on information and understanding the use of properties. So we had several obviously different usages listed there, and they need to be fully understood. And obviously Alan has a lot of experience, but there's also a team of people behind him as well with specialist knowledge, etc., around some of those functions that we do rely on to build up that valuation.
Okay, great, thank you. Frank's asked a really good one here. If a property has an offer in writing that is much higher than your valuation, is this taken into consideration?
Yes, Paul, I'll take that one. Thanks. An offer in writing is not considered evidence technically. So it would not be, but I'd like to know about it as a valuer, and let's have a think. But it's not. The valuers are looking for evidence in the marketplace, and what's considered evidence is a settled sale. Now, not an offer, not even a signed contract, probably, but a settled sale is solid evidence of value. So that would be the prime thing, and everything after that would be interesting, but not necessarily considered.
Okay, thanks. I thought that was a good one. We've had a question from Darren about disturbance. If an easement impacts a business like a B&B or a wedding photo venue to the point that the business has to close, how's compensation considered above the avoidance in the first instance?
And once again, I'll bring this back to assuming that the easement actually occurs on that land, Michael. Then yes, it is a consideration. We have provisions built into the agreements that we will be discussing with landowners that will consider the disturbance that I suppose the easement, but also our construction activities have on that. And we'll look into obviously assessing compensation. If that's specifically related to, if you're talking about during the construction period, etc., the disturbance, Alan, I'm not sure whether the meaning there, if we're talking about longer term impacts on that.
Yes, Paul, look, there's probably two parts to that. The immediate impact during that construction phase and that initial period would be clearly disturbance because, there's a direct financial loss. If it was deemed that there was a long-term impact or probably going to be a long-term impact, it might well factor into the market value. And again, we need to make very sure that we're not missing out on that or in fact doubling up, but particularly making sure they're not missing any damage that's caused in that respect.
Okay. Thanks very much. This one is also from Darren. Is compensation a one-off payment or an annual payment, as it is with wind farms? And is this compensation agreement added to the land title?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a distinct difference between wind farms and obviously the project that we're looking at here. Whereas wind farms normally have a certain life cycle that they operate over and they work on lease type arrangements and shorter term agreements. Whereas the power lines that we're looking here will form part of the network and are on a property in perpetuity. The impacts obviously of a shorter term occupancy, and I may pass over to Alan to discuss some of this in a moment, just in relation to the calculation of compensation for a shorter term occupancy. But where we're talking about an easement that remains on the title and is there to host those power lines in perpetuity, whilst there are precedent that we can, put payments out over a longer period of time, we found that the traditional methodology for that is a one-off payment that considers all of the those four components and is paid out as a larger sum at the start. Alan, I'm not sure whether you wanted to touch on that.
I think you've covered it, Paul. I think that's how it traditionally works, and probably equally best for the landowners in that case where it's permanent, yes.
Great, thank you.
But I think, Michael, just there, we're happy to talk to landowners about that on an individual basis. But I expect, you know, the compensation is calculated as to what the impacts of the line are, considering that it will be there over a permanent time, whereas unlike a wind farm or another facility there, which is deemed to be a shorter term lease arrangement, that the compensation would be the same calculation. And whether it was taken as a lump sum payment up front or whether it was taken as I suppose, an annuity payment over a period of time, we could discuss that with landowners on an individual basis.
Okay, great to hear there's some flexibility there. That's good. I've got a question from Wes and Brilly. What happens when you've just built on the edge of an easement and you no longer feel you can live there due to the new line? It says here 5th generation farmers, so we can't just sell up and leave.
So if people have built, well, with the location of the actual easement itself, and I think once again the location of that, I think Barton's presentation the other evening discussed about the location of that and how we are seeking to have as large a buffer from dwellings as we possibly can. I think where once again, if that was coming within that sort of proximity to a dwelling, and it was so heavily encumbering that property, I think once again on an individual basis we would need to speak to that landowner about a suitable solution.
Okay, sounds good. Anne has got here. She says, I have stud cattle. I will at various times during the year have calves and bulls depastured with cows. If I have to delay or postpone breeding in my farm due to works, I would I be compensated and a little bit more for as long as the works are on, as the works take on my farm? The loss of breeding could be 3+ years of loss of income. Would this be considered in the compensation? Tell me if you want me to read it again. It was a long one.
No, I think, and once again, it is hard for us to sort of talk about individual circumstances like that without knowing how we may be able to go about mitigating some of those disturbances, Michael. But I think we have touched on the fact that the disturbance that's caused during that construction period, you know, that where that causes a disturbance to the business operations of a property, we do need to have individual discussions with the landowner about how we may be able to, I suppose, work around some of those potential impacts, where there may be opportunities there to, I suppose, remove those impacts if possible, but where not, to work out solutions for them. We do need to look at compensation. If there's a financial loss that's incurred by that, it does form part of the compensation calculation, yes.
Okay, thanks. So these sort of individualised things are the things that the land engagement officers would be keen to talk through to try and work out the best solutions case by case with landowners. Is it?
Yeah,
is that
definitely.
fair to say?
Yeah, look, that's definitely the case, Michael. And, you know, it is very difficult on some of these communications tonight, simply because without determining the exact route of the easement through property, and then there are still opportunities there to look at the location of equipment within that route to minimise disturbance on properties. There's still a way to go before we finalise those compensation calculations, and there will be a transition period there once the route is announced, where we will need to have ongoing conversations with landowners, not only about fully understanding their own operations, but ways that we can work around equipment, etc., to try to reduce any impacts. Those conversations, you know, with the liaisons and obviously valuers and potentially other professionals that are helping with design, are really important in that regard. So I think that's probably going to be the key to understanding all of those individual properties. And we will then be able to have those individual communications. There are some one-on-one sessions coming up, and for people that have really specific questions, would really encourage you to sign on for one of those.
Sounds good, thank you. It's a good one from Alan. What about fencing? How are we compensated for the changes to our farm layout?
Well, okay. I don't know that farm layouts might, well, depends. Let's have a look at the circumstances. If it's necessary to fence, well, as a result of the acquisition, then I'd like to think that would be compensatable. But in most cases, I don't know that I've seen anywhere there's a transmission line where an existing fence line hasn't been reinstated after construction, let's say, and the farm continues on. But look, there'll be circumstance when that's not the case, and it would have to be considered and taken into account.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. We have one from Angela. Can you claim compensation for disturbance after the project has been built if it turns out that you lost more than you expected? For example, more of a loss in trade in tourism or something along those lines?
I'll have a go at that again, Paul. Look, you couldn't rule it out, and I would think that if that's the case, it would be certainly considered. Let's have a look at how it works and what it meant to that property. I'd be surprised if the valuations were done properly, that it wasn't fully taken into account, but it's possible, of course.
Okay, thank you. Good question, Angela. We have a question from Darren. Who pays land tax on easements? Is it the landowners, AusNet, or energy consumers via pass-throughs?
AusNet services do pay land tax on transmission easements. Obviously, landowners will pay their own land tax as appropriate, as determined under taxation legislation. I think that's a broader taxation conversation, Michael. I'm not really sure whether I'm qualified to answer that. Alan, I'm not sure whether that falls into your delegation on those matters, but yeah.
No, that's one of those jobs, Paul, where we would seek some advice from the experts. So there'd be some accountants or the tax office which would give some rulings on those things. And if there was a case, well, again, it'd have to be considered. Most farmland's probably land tax exempt, but that won't apply to all property.
Okay. Just a quick follow-up. That one is, I think Darren asked that question to know if it counts as a project cost. Is that something that you can speak to, Paul?
Not really, Michael. I think that's more of a a regulatory cost that he's discussing there about arrangements between the regulator AEMO and AusNet services. That's something for probably outside of this discussion. Yeah,
broader question. Good question. Thank you. Justin's asked, does compensation include allowances for any machinery or equipment that is no longer able to be used, and for the purchase of any new, items or reconfigurations or anything like that?
I think, look, when we talk about, the disturbance, I think there's a valid case there to say that, if and Alan touched on this a little bit earlier, that if there's a loss incurred on a property due to the construction or the presence of the easement, there's probably a crossover once there again between market value. And, I've had discussions with a few farmers in relation to the irrigation practices. And, in those circumstances, what we would look at, Michael, is, are there other potential ways that irrigation can occur than the particular way that it's occurring? We would look at those sort of things. The role of compensation is to restore landowners to the same position as they were prior, as much as possible. And if that can't be done through mitigating the impacts, obviously through compensation. So it is something that we would discuss with landowners in relation to farming practices, and if it was making equipment redundant, etc., we'd need to get a full understanding of how that was.
Okay. Thanks, sounds good. Moira has asked, when is compensation paid, before, during or after the completion of the project? And will it be paid in full or a part payment? I think the full and part that we may have covered, that there's a couple of options there.
Yep.
But in terms of timing, could you speak to that?
Yes, we can. So there's, I suppose there's two different scenarios we spoke about here, Michael. And the first one was where we have an easement that is negotiated between an authority and a landowner. With this particular project, we'll be starting those discussions with landowners once the route is determined to form an option to take an easement at a later stage. There'll be further information coming out around that process very shortly, I believe. In those circumstances, we would exercise an option. At that point in time, the predominant portion of the compensation is payable, with the balance payable when the easement is actually registered on the title. With statutory easements, where it is done through legislation, there are certain provisions about those payments being made when the notice of intent to acquire the land is done. An offer is made around that compensation, and there's a rigid process around that payment when those processes move forward.
Okay, thanks very much. I think you partially answered Jim's question here about easements showing up on titles, on the property title, which they do. Jim's also, assume it's the same, Jim's asked another question. An easement on a 200 hectare property will have less of an impact than when compared to a 30 hectare property. How do you consider that in terms of the compensation?
That's one for you, Alan.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Look, the valuers would go back to valuations 101, of course, and go, what's the value of the property before, and let's look at the easement and its effects, and let's look at it again afterwards. And yes, proportionally on a 30 hectare property, it could be, but if it just nips through a corner as opposed to going through the centre of a 200 hectare property, the considerations will be, different things will be considered, and there will be an answer result of that, and that's the reason we've got to look at each one individually. It's not always about the size of the property, but it's about where it lies, where it sits in the landscape, and what it means to those to that owner and what they're using it for. So there are a lot of factors to take into account.
Great, thank you. Trying to make sure we cover off as many of the topics that people are asking about. There's another question here. Frank has asked, if a compensation amount cannot be agreed, would there be a third-party independent valuer considered?
I tend to find, Alan, you may disagree with me here, but there should be no reason why valuers can't agree. There is a mediation process that normally works around that. But yes, there is a mediation process that works through that, and we'll be detailing that in a lot more detail. It can sometimes go to a third-party adjudicator in those cases, but we would hope that by acting fair and reasonably, and by following those principles, Michael, there shouldn't be a huge discrepancy between valuers if they're applying those principles.
Great, thank you. Barb has asked, what is the compensation cost for a tower? Is the compensation cost less for a property that only has cables over their property rather than towers? How has that worked out?
I'll answer that, Paul. Look, and again, each property is going to be looked at in its own right. Well, you'd think that perhaps towers have more of an impact, but there'll be circumstances where it won't just be about the towers or the wires. It's about other aspects, and each property be considered in its own right. And again, the impacts will be considered and turned into a difference between that before and after value of the property.
Okay, thank you. Thomas has asked if there is replanting of trees required for the project. Will that be something that is compensated for?
Where vegetation is removed from an easement, so obviously there are certain limitations to what can actually be within the easement. We have had some circumstances where we've, we're happy to discuss with landowners alternative plantings, but they would need to be outside of that easement or restricted in height within the easement. We have on an alternate project that I worked on, Michael, we were looking at some trees that had been planted for shade for livestock. And in those circumstances, we did actually plant extensively in another region of the property to provide similar shade. Obviously, it does take time for those to grow to a height where they'd provide the same shade, but we do look at alternatives that we can do to assist in that regard, yes.
Great, thank you. This one I will answer. Peter's asked, when will the proposed route be announced, and is it then open for community submissions and refinement? We're in the process of working through the technical information based on the field studies that we're completing at the moment. That's helping us figure out where the least impact route will in fact be. We're hoping to be in a position before the end of the year to announce a proposed or preferred route for the project. That is the one that will receive the most intensive study and will be submitted with the EES as the proposed route. And then that is the route that the impact assessment will be completed on. And the impact assessment will have a public exhibition period where anyone is welcome to make a submission to the panel assessing the project for approval. And they will all be considered in the process. So that gives you a rough idea in terms of timing of when the final route will come out and when the step in the process in terms of being able to make submissions and contribute to the project there. I would encourage all of you to actively engage with the project however you can to share information about aspects that are of value to you in the landscape that should be considered, be it social, economic, cultural, environmental, or other, because all this information helps us find the least impact route possible, which is in all of our interest. Stuart's asked a question: can any other boundary realignment be done at the same time as adding an easement? This is often done with road easement projects, apparently.
Yeah, I think Michael here, roads are probably a little bit of a different prospect in that they're actually acquiring part of the land as an ownership of the land. Yeah. Where we are taking an easement which is overlaid on the existing title boundaries. So at that stage, the cadastral boundary of the property doesn't change as such. This is an overlay that goes on top of that.
Okay.
I think it's important to understand with an easement that the underlying land remains in the ownership of the landowner. This is where we touched earlier on, where we said that an easement actually allows us the right to access and to construct and build those power lines on land owned by another person, but obviously they still retain the ownership of that land.
Okay, thank you. I will just try and get a couple more in here quickly if we can, and that will, I think, cover the key topics and most of the questions here. Darren has asked, in response to the earlier answer about one-off payments versus annual compensation, if the easements are going to impact the land and the business operations over many years, can we assume that the compensation for economic disruption will also consider the life of the project, for however long it might exist?
I'm not sure whether I'm totally understanding that, Michael, but where we talk about disturbance and those elements of compensation during construction, obviously those considerations are there. When we talk about the life of this project, transmission lines of this nature that normally form I suppose, part of the grid that allows transmission of electricity around the state as part of the national electricity market are much longer term. They usually remain on a title in perpetuity, and the assessment normally looks at that impact over that full term, over the life of the assets, which is a longer term. Alan's talked about those components a bit earlier. I know, Alan, you can come in here if you'd like, but the market value of the property is determined on a before and after. What is the value of the property now in the market, and what is the value of the property after that easement and transmission line have been installed?
Yeah, look, that's right. The other side of that, of course, is the project's going to be in perpetuity, which may well outlast a business. And I think that the present value of the forward payments probably better off to the landowners. But look, that's something you'd have to consider in each case again.
Okay, thank you. Couple more quickly. Is there a preferred choice to use government or state-owned land as opposed to private land? Moira's asked.
Yeah, look, I think that comes down more to a planning issue, Michael. And I did have a conversation earlier on today with someone about unused roads. And, you know, there's, as you've said, when we're looking at these impact assessments, you know, there's a range of factors that have to be considered. And, you know, there is a lot of ecological value when we talk about government land. We're talking national parks and state forests in some circumstances, as well as unmade roads and various other things as to private land. Each of them has their own unique characteristics and have to be assessed on the impact. Yeah. So I think, you know, that comes down once again more to the route selection, which is probably outside of the scope of the discussion tonight. Yeah. You know, the compensation and those sort of things we're discussing tonight relates more to privately owned land rather than government land. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's outside of the topic here. Okay. And we'll do one last one quickly. If the transmission line is selected to go near an outbuilding or a shed, are people compensated for moving or replacing these sorts of buildings? Yeah, I'll touch on that one, Alan. So, you know, Alan did talk about before, you know, the various different sort of levels of compensation. And when we talk about that loss of market value, et cetera, it does also incorporate factors for depreciations of buildings. We're once again avoiding wherever possible, impacting on those structures and buildings wherever we can. If it becomes unavoidable, and there is an outbuilding or something like that that is requiring some sort of amendment like that, compensation is payable, you know, to either rebuild, move, or replace that structure. Yes. Great. Thanks very much. We might just move into the closing slides now, Paul, if you could step us through to the next one. I'd like to thank everybody for coming along and raising great questions tonight and having a chance to talk through the issues of most interest to people. We're very keen to continue these conversations. We encourage you to do the online survey, which we're about to post out in the interest of improving our webinars over time. If you would like to meet with a specialist, we're doing sessions in October. Please book in or register there. And as always, please send us questions or comments you've got through the project email. Next one. Thanks, Paul. Look, we certainly acknowledge that the project creates a level of uncertainty and concern for landowners and communities where the projects potentially will be. And we encourage anybody who is struggling with the challenge of this to reach out to the support services that we've got listed here. These are entirely independent of AusNet and are there to provide
support to people in crisis. So we strongly encourage you to reach out if you think that will help. That concludes tonight's webinar. Again, thank you so much for coming along, and please come along to the following webinars. There's one tomorrow night and 3 on next week. Thanks very much. Have a lovely evening.